Well, let's get this one out of the way so that we can move on to covering more interesting things in this update. Today, we're going to talk about the Tier 7 Premium American Aircraft Carrier, USS Enterprise, which is the campaign reward for the ongoing July 2024 update in World of Warships Legends, making it only the second CV to be a campaign reward in the game's history, following the Independence at Tier 5, which was a reward for a campaign a long time ago, so long ago that I barely even remember it. Unfortunately, though, the Enterprise, while it is a historical ship, a very famous one, a legendary one, you might say, in game, it's mediocre at best. I'll talk about why. As usual, we'll run down the stats. Keep in mind it's influenced by my commander build. Here I'll show you the commander and the mod selection so you can see what I'm talking about. The inspirations on Ernest King are Swirsky for extra concealment and Space Fishy for a little bit more speed on the airdropped torpedoes. The stats I read to you will be influenced by the skills that these commanders and these modules provide. Now, before we get into the planes, which are sort of the highlight we need to talk about, or the low light rather, we're going to go over the stats for everything else, but I want to tell you why I'm showing you this particular match over some of the others, because I've got some others recorded, and the damage in those other matches was a lot better, as was the XP and my place on the leaderboard. However, I think this match is more representative of what you can expect from the Enterprise. It's a very mediocre total of damage done, and we get to see some good examples throughout of the two types of bombers dealing with all three classes of surface ships. Torpedo bombers, AP dive bombers against battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. In fact, I think we're going to end up getting first blood by sinking the enemy destroyer here shortly. But before that, let's take a look at how these AP dive bombers go against a battleship. I've played the Enterprise a few times now, and I've had some instances where these AP dive bombers did citadel some battleships, but most of the time when you drop them on a battleship, you get a result like that, with 4 penetrations, a shatter, even a ricochet, and that was like, what, 4,000 damage maybe? Not too impressive. In any case, we'll talk in detail about why, but to begin with, the USS Enterprise has 51,400 HP and 28% torpedo damage reduction. Nothing too crazy there. I'd say that's pretty average for a CV. It's also got artillery guns, secondary guns that is, which also double as AA mounts. There are 8 of them, 127 millimeters. They have a 5 km firing range. HE does a maximum of 1800 with a 5% fire chance. No sense, I think, in building into secondaries for this vessel like you might with maybe the Graf Zeppelin if you wanted to meme, I guess. No point in that with the Enterprise. The AA defense aggregate rating on the Enterprise is surprisingly 82, which I think seems low as an aggregate rating for a carrier. But what does that aggregate rating even mean? However, though, the long-range AA on the Enterprise is those secondary guns, the 8 127mm mounts. They've got a 5.6 kilometer range, and the average DPS is 70. Then, the more mid-range AA, the Bofors, which it has numerous mounts for, they have a 3.9 kilometer range, and the average DPS is somewhere around 105 or 99, depending on if we're talking about the Bofors Mark 1 or Bofors Mark 2. I think this CV might have less AA than your typical CV, in other words, although if that's noticeable, I don't know, because how often are carriers trying to snipe each other? I didn't have too many instances of that where I was shooting down a lot of planes. I guess this is a good time to talk about the AP dive bombers, though, because there we get a citadel against the Amalfi. And I've been told that these AP dive bombers are pretty good against cruisers. I have yet to see it. I think at some point in this game, we're going to drop another cruiser and get multiple citadels. In fact, it might be that same Amalfi near the end of the match. But let's just talk about these dive bombers. For the torpedo bombers, we've got SB-2C Hell Divers. They've got 3,419 hit points. Their maximum speed is 177 knots. There are 3 in each attacking unit, and there are 9 per flight squadron. They're detectable at a range of 7.2 kilometers, and when they drop their AP dive bombers, each plane drops 3 bombs. So 3 planes in an attack squadron, 3 bombs dropped. That's 9 bombs total, which probably sounds like a lot. Maybe not quite as many as the British CVs, which do the carpet bombing thing, and I think do have more bombs, but certainly more bombs than the Saipan, for example, or the Lexington at Tier 7. And these AP dive bombers have an alpha strike of 2,700. That's right, 2,700. That's the damage they do when they hit the Citadel, which is why the single Citadel against the Amalfi probably seemed so anemic and underwhelming. The dive bombers have a flight range of 38 kilometers. They restore in 29 seconds. So the restoration time is very good. You don't tend to run out of these planes too much. But when you drop the dive bombers on battleships especially, you don't really expect too many citadels. Instead, you get full penetrations or potentially even overpens. And, well, full penetrations, overpens, not going to be a lot of damage. 270 damage on an overpen might be some of the lowest in the entire game in terms of AP characteristics. And then the full pen damage is not as much as what you get when you hit a citadel. So even that is going to feel quite underwhelming. I think the biggest single hit I've managed to score on a battleship with these AP dive bombers is something like 8,000, which is a respectable chunk of damage. But the times that I've gotten that are few and far between. Most of the drops on battleships look mediocre, like that one earlier on the Iowa. As for cruisers, well, for the Amalfi, there we go. 2 citadels, and that's like, 6,000 damage at the most? If you repeatedly drop cruisers with these things and get citadels, then after a while, the damage does start to add up. And these planes, I feel like, are fairly tanky. They turn very, very quickly, so you can get them back on target very soon. And they're a 9K drop against the Amalfi. So decent damage at the very least against cruisers. Against battleships, not so much. And don't even think about dropping these AP dive bombers on destroyers unless you are okay with getting 270 damage on overpens. The torpedo bombers, on the other hand, are significantly better, I would say. Their HP is 2,785. They're a little slower at 168 knots. There's also 3 of them in an attacking squadron with a full squadron of 9. They have an 8 km detectability range. Each drops 1 torpedo for a total of 3. The torpedoes hit for a maximum damage of 6,467, which is not as much as some other CVs might do. Torpedo speed is fairly low at 43 knots. Torpedoes have a 3.5 kilometer range. 36 km flight distance for the torpedo bombers, and restoration time is 27 seconds. So the thing does print planes pretty quickly, and the torpedo bombers are probably more like the bread and butter of this thing. I think earlier in the match we sunk the one enemy DD with the torpedoes. That's how you're going to have to deal with destroyers, is with the torpedoes here. And of course, they do decent damage against both cruisers and battleships. They are certainly, in my opinion, the primary source of damage on this vessel, which is probably disappointing for those of you who like CVs, considering this one is unique. It's an American CV with AP dive bombers, and it's the only one with AP dive bombers. But the dive bombers are not very good. So there you have it for the Enterprise's aircraft stats. It's got good maneuverability characteristics with a 32.5 knot speed, got a 1,070 meter turning circle and a 13.1 second rudder shift. and with my build, it's got a respectable 11.3 kilometer detectability by sea. But it's just not a very good aircraft carrier. And full disclosure, I am not a regular aircraft carrier player. I don't like aircraft carrier gameplay. That's why I sort of want to get this video out of the way before anything else and give you my thoughts on the Enterprise. So, your mileage may vary. If you are a dedicated sort of CV main, maybe this is something you would like, but I can't imagine why. I think the value in this ship is probably just going to be its historical significance, although the fact that I think it is so mediocre probably suggests it'll get a buff in the future. And maybe that's a good way to add CVs. Add them weak and mediocre and buff them later if necessary, rather than add them completely overpowered and nerf them and make everybody mad who finished the campaign. I personally wouldn't recommend this one unless you just want all the goodies throughout the campaign with the Admiralty backing. That's the only reason I would pay for the Admiralty backing on this campaign. There are many more interesting ships in this update, and we will cover them over the next few days and weeks. Hope you enjoyed this video on the USS Enterprise. Give the video a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.